So there's two clear nights coming up here, and I'm out here in the shed swapping out gear. And I know all of you know I'm an Olympus guy, okay? I use Olympus cameras. Those are the cameras I prefer. And Olympus is coming out with a new wow camera, okay? And I thought we'd just take this time to kind of maybe complain a little bit about some of the disastrous mistakes that Olympus has made in the past, with a few rules. The new wow camera is coming out, and of course, I'm probably going to say wonderful things about it. And I don't want you to think that I'm some Olympus fanboy. That's kind of the #1 reason why I'm doing this video. I'm not some mindless idiot who buys one particular camera, regardless of the technology. Another rule that I'm going to put in place here is that I'm only going to talk about stuff that happened at least 10 years ago. And then I'm also going to keep this discussion rather broad and general. I don't want to really talk about specific features that were my pet peeve or something like that. So let's get into it. The very first one that I have, and I even have an outline for this because I don't want to forget anything, the PenF System. Now I'm not talking about the digital PenF, which is a really cool camera if you haven't ever tried to get your hands on one. They are like a cult camera for sure. I don't know why they're popular. That just everybody loves the way they look. And the old PenFs, they were beautiful too, okay? But my biggest complaint is that Olympus deserted the PenF System, I think, too early. There was definitely, I think, room for the PenF System to continue on. And if you don't know much about the PenF System, it was a half-frame film system, which allowed you to get 72 pictures per roll of film. You know, it just had a lot of cool things about it. And it really should have been the system that would have been in place when Kodak had the stupid idea of coming out with APS-C film. If you don't know about APS-C film, go do your research. It ruined photography. It did not make it fun. It made photography a miserable experience for the amateur, okay? Now, the OM system, and you know, the PenF days and the OM system, these were the golden days of Olympus. You know, these were the years that they just were so prosperous and they developed so many cool ideas, but yeah, they still had some problems. You know, of course, my first complaint there was that they deserted the PenF System, I think, too early. They should have kept it going along with the OM system. So the OM system was just incredibly successful, and they basically ran it like crazy for, you know, 10, 15 years. And then in the 1985 kind of period, after they came out with some new lenses, they basically deserted the system. Why? Okay, why wouldn't you keep something good like that going? You know, and then I think one of the other things that the OM system always kind of lacked, and even when I was using the OM system back in, you know, the early 90s and the early 2000s, before, you know, digital was kind of mainstream, and, you know, film was kind of still a major contender, well, there just were no zoom lenses available for the OM system. You know, why didn't they develop zoom lenses for the OM system? I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of professionals left the system and went on to other cameras. And of course, the other one was there's no autofocus for the OM system. You know, why didn't they come out with an autofocus system? I know some people was like, oh, they would have had to change bayonets. Not really. I mean, look at Nikon, okay? They managed to preserve their lens bayonet mount. You know, they just basically did some technical engineering wizardry and they got it to work. And really, you know, I'm an engineer, okay? Like, I look at the bayonet mount of the OM system. They could have done it, okay? They could have put autofocus into their cameras. Now, I know the late 80s, the early 90s, I think was too early for autofocus, okay? I've used some of those cameras. Oh, they're horrible, painful to use, okay? Manual focus was still kind of thing, but there were niche areas that needed it. And I think, though, in the late 90s, they really should have had autofocus in the OM system, especially into the early 2000s, all right? So, the next thing I want to complain about, and this was a broad marketing decision by Olympus, is that after they kind of deserted the OM system, they really heavily focused on the amateur camera market, okay? You know, and they also put a lot of their resources into their medical industry, which of course exploded, especially recently. But yeah, okay, here's the problem with putting all of your resources into the amateur market. Okay, back then, professionals were very brand loyal, okay? Amateurs were not. They've never been brand loyal, okay? So putting all this resources and all this time into developing a big amateur following, which in the 90s they did. Olympus was very successful at, you know, they point and shoot Olympus cameras were everywhere. But, you know, those people just aren't brand loyal. And as soon as somebody else came out with something better, boom, they deserted Olympus, okay? You know, and that's kind of something you could say throughout all of the 90s. Now, we're going to get into the E system here, okay? This is where, you know, I was probably the most involved with Olympus gear, okay? The E system. When Olympus came out with the E system, okay, on a technological standpoint, it was on par with all the other companies out there, even a little bit ahead, okay? And as a matter of fact, there was some technology that was baked into the E1 that is still not found in some of today's high-end cameras. Number one being the dust reduction system that's in all of Olympus cameras today. Yeah, why the other manufacturers haven't caught on to that is just beyond me. And here's the disastrous mistake, and this was such a disaster, okay? When Olympus came out with the E system, they only had lenses from basically 28mm equivalents up to 600mm. They didn't have any wide-angle lenses. Now, let me give you a little background here, okay? In the late 90s and in the early 2000s, there was this big revolution going on where, like, especially photojournalists, and you can go back and look at old newspaper pictures, everything's taken with a wide-angle lens in the newspapers, okay? Photojournalists were a major category, okay, in photography. And everybody was wide-angle zoom lens crazy, okay? 16 to 35mm zoom lenses were just the rage, okay? Everybody wanted one, everyone was buying them, they were selling like crazy. And so when Olympus came out with their E system, and all the other manufacturers were dealing with cropped sensors that basically didn't allow you to have a wide-angle lens, well, Olympus came out with their E system, and they didn't have a freaking wide-angle lens. And so, you can tell I'm kind of ticked about this. This is one of the things I take personally because I was one of those guys who wanted a wide-angle lens. And yeah, they came out with a system, oh yeah, well we've got this 11 to 22mm, which would have been a 22 to 44mm zoom that's in development, you know, about 18 months from now you'll be able to buy it. And I'm like, no, now. I was like, why in the world would you come out with a system that doesn't have the wide-angle spectrum covered, okay? Especially when nobody else was able to do it digitally. Okay, just a golden opportunity there was missed. And it's the biggest reason why the E system was a failure. So another reason why the E system was a failure was just the enormous gaps between their pro-level cameras. You know, they kept on coming out with amateur cameras, you know, and this is more the stupidity of Olympus, why they were always so obsessed about the amateur market and not caring for their professionals first. You know, because the professionals are what tell amateurs what to buy. Well, yeah, they had these big long spans of development between their pro cameras. I mean, look at the difference between the E1 and the E3. There's a 5-year gap between the two. 5 freaking years, folks, okay? Let me tell you something about professionals, okay? We professionals, if we don't see a new pro camera within a 2-year time span, we start looking at other cameras. That's the mindset of every professional I've ever known, myself included. If we don't see a new camera in 2 years, yeah, we look elsewhere. And don't think to yourself that, oh, they've bought all these lenses, so they're kind of captured. No, that is working less and less today. You know, as a matter of fact, today, people switch mounts. Oh, man, like they changed their socks. You know, it's crazy how many photographers I know that have changed camera systems several times in the last 5 years. You know, I know a few that have in the last 5 years, and they've changed bayonets 5 times. You know, and these are people with very big lens portfolios. You know, of at least 8 or more lenses. That's what I think of as a big lens portfolio. Another mistake that they made with the lenses in the 4/3 systems was that 300mm f2.8. Now that lens was really incredible, okay, and still to this day it's incredible. I would love to own it someday. The price on it continues to come down, and I will probably swipe one here eventually. But when that lens came out, okay, Olympus made a huge pricing mistake, I think, okay? They expected to sell a lot of those to wildlife photographers. And yeah, they just priced it stupidly, okay? They priced it, I think it was almost 8,000 bucks, okay? It was very, very expensive. And everybody looked at it and was like, okay, it's a 300mm f2.8. Everybody else is selling their 300mm f2.8s for around 3,000 bucks. And Olympus charged, you know, close to 8,000. Yeah, it didn't sell, folks. And that was a hugely missed opportunity. Olympus could have got their foot in the door with wildlife photography, and they failed there, okay? And now today, though, they've kind of rectified that mistake, and they're really starting to capitalize on the advantages of their system, which is awesome, okay? But yeah, that lens, that 300mm f2.8, it was such a missed opportunity, folks, such a missed opportunity. They sold so few of those lenses that there was only one person in the factory who assembled them, and they did it one at a time by hand. One last thing, okay, this is my last complaint, the last big mistake that I think Olympus has ever made. Well, actually, there's two here, okay? So the MFT system, okay, you will often hear me referring to it as the MFT system, or I still refer to it as the 4/3 system. The reason why I call it MFT or 4/3 is because I hate the name Micro Four Thirds, okay? It is, I think, the biggest marketing mistake that has ever been made with the Micro Four Thirds system, okay? And this was actually not entirely Olympus's fault. Panasonic, I think, was mostly involved with the development of the mirrorless version of the 4/3 bayonet, okay? And I don't know if maybe Olympus was involved with it and they were part of the whole naming convention, but really, folks, micro is not a good word to have in your name, okay? Micro in English means tiny, okay? And you'll notice that if you go back and you read older articles and reviews about 4/3 cameras, nobody really made fun of the 4/3 system for having the smaller sensor, okay? But when the Micro 4/3 system came out, suddenly everybody starts making fun of how small the sensor is, okay? That's a language thing, okay? It has to do with the way people perceive things, and just because of the wording and where that word falls. Now, the dictionary definition of the word doesn't really count here, okay? I know they're trying to say it's smaller than the 4/3 system, and yes, it is, but really, folks, what they should have called it was the mirrorless 4/3 system, and they still could fix this, by the way. They still could rename it just the mirrorless 4/3 system, because it would still have MFT as its abbreviation, you know, but it would get rid of that stupid word micro, because let me tell you, that has cost Olympus and Panasonic customers. Really, it has. And then I guess the last little thing, and this is really a small quibble on my part, and that's the format of Micro Four Thirds. Now, I've used 4:3 aspect ratio on Mamiya cameras back in the film days when I was, you know, professionally I would shoot with Mamiya cameras, okay? And I also used Olympus gear too for professional instances, but most of the time when I was doing paid stuff, I used Mamiya equipment. So that's a 4:3 aspect ratio approximately type aspect camera, okay? So I have no quibbles with the aspect ratio of it, okay? But I do wish that Olympus had made the system, the sensor, just maybe like 5% larger. And the reason for this is because when most people look at how wide a lens is, okay, they look at the right half and the left half of the frame. They do not look at the corners, okay? That's not how the average person judges how wide a lens is. And because 4/3 is a more square aspect, which is a more efficient aspect, you actually get more lens per image circle sorry, you get more photons of light per image circle, which is kind of one of the reasons why astrophotographers like myself like to use MFT. This is just one of the reasons. But anyways, the amateur, we look at the right and left edges, not the corners, okay? So yeah, if it really was to be truly equivalent, or like, a 2x crop that the amateur would look at and think that it was a 2x crop, I think that the system maybe should have been just 5% larger, and that would have given the perception that it was truly a 2x crop instead of feeling like a 2.1x crop, because that's really how the 4/3 system kind of feels. And this is something that I've kind of thought about for a long time, and it wasn't really until I bought a 25mm f1.2 from Olympus and I started using it, and I started thinking to myself, like, this doesn't feel like a 50mm lens. It feels more like a 55 or 60mm lens on my OM1. And that's because, we think of the right and left edges of the frame as being how wide a lens is rather than the corners, all right? So, hey, I hope you enjoyed this rant or complaining session, whatever you want to call it, I'm certainly excited about the WOW cameras coming out. I will definitely have thoughts about it, and I will be on a discussion with Red 35, Jimmy Chen, and a couple of the other big YouTubers, and we're going to talk about the new WOW camera that comes out, and I, of course, will have lots and lots of thoughts about, how this camera is going to perform for astrophotography in particular. All right, thanks, guys.